So Darwin and Wallace, so while Darwin worked on natural selection during the early 1800s or mid-1800s, Alfred Russel Wallace was a younger naturalist studying in Indonesia, and he admired Darwin, so he sent Darwin a letter saying, hey, man, I kind of figured out this process of how things change. I'm basically describing natural selection. And so Darwin was like, oh, that's my life's work, and then rushed to publish his Origin of Species. Wallace does get credit as well for natural selection. However, Darwin is a bit more famous because of it. So now here's Darwin's argument. His observation was that variation exists in populations, and variation is an inherited trait. So when we look at a population, you can see there's lots of variation in the offspring. I only have 2 kids, but my 2 kids look very different from each other. His second observation is that more individuals are born than can survive, which will lead to like a struggle for existence, which is one of his inferences. Anyway, inference number 1. Individuals with traits better suited to their environment survive and reproduce. So here is like a riparian ecosystem. And let's say there's some beetles that live here. And these beetles, there's variation within the population. They're not all identical, thanks to sexually reproducing populations with crossing over, random fertilization, independent assortment, etc. And so here there's predators that are going to eat the beetles, like depending on their phenotypes and how likely they are to stand out or camouflage. So over time, even though there were lots of individuals born, they don't all survive. Some of them are better at surviving than others depending on their phenotypes. And so when we look at this, you can see here the surviving beetles are able to then have offspring. They're the remaining ones. So that next generation has a slightly different combination of traits and phenotypes. So when we look at his inference number 2, is that this unequal ability for individuals to survive and reproduce will lead to an accumulation of favorable traits in the population over generations. And so, hence, we call it today natural selection. So here we have a population of mice, and they've moved into an area where the rocks are very dark. And then due to natural variation, some mice are black while others are tan. Well, obviously, some are going to be better camouflaged than others, and so some are going to stand out and get eaten by birds easier, leaving more of the darker phenotype to survive and reproduce in the next generation. Hence, survival of the fittest. And so an organism's heritable traits can influence not only its own performance, but also how well its offspring cope with environmental challenges. So here you can see some tarantulas. There's many eggs, maybe up to 1,000 eggs. However, not all of them are going to survive. And so when we look at this, you have a struggle for survival. And the ones who are better at surviving and reproducing are the ones who are going to have their genes in the next generation. So natural selection results from predators, lack of food, adverse physical conditions, anything that leads to competition and struggle within their own population, their own species, intra-specific competition. A spider and a spider competing for resources. One of them is going to have genes and alleles and phenotypes that make them better able at surviving. So these gradual changes accumulate and less favorable ones diminish over time. So when we look at natural selection, it's a result between the interactions between the individuals and their environment. And so another fascinating thing is natural selection can only amplify or diminish differing heritable traits. And so therefore natural selection needs variation. It cannot exist in a asexual reproducing population that's all identical clones. Luckily, there's mutations that create variation when it's asexual. Okay, so here, let's go ahead and see an example of industrial melanization with the peppered moths. So the variation that existed, you have the light, like peppered moths right here that have like kind of spotted wings, then you have the dark ones. Now, depending on the environment, what is considered high fitness or favorable traits varies. And so here's like a real picture, and right here is actually that peppered moth camouflaging really well on the lichens. Over here you can see how it would have low fitness in the dark trees. So over time, natural selection can increase the match between organisms and their environment. Here's some rock pocket mice that depending, you can see there's like lava and sand in the environment. So depending on which surface they're on would determine their fitness. And so in the lighter habitat, the allele for light color fur becomes more frequent or increases in its frequency, whereas in the darker habitat, the allele for darker phenotype would have the high fitness. So the environment does determine which phenotypes are selected for. So natural selection is always happening, but which traits are beneficial depends on the context in which the species lives and mates. Another key point is that natural selection is the process of editing, and it's not a creative mechanism. And the last point I'd like to make is that individuals don't evolve. So here I have a deer. It's pretty well camouflaged in this environment. And so this deer either survives or it doesn't survive. So here we look at a population of deer. What we see is that some of them are going to have traits that make them stand out and not so well camouflaged. So that would be considered low fitness. Now, the individuals are selected for or against. So when we talk about a certain trait being selected for, that implies high fitness. When we talk about a trait being selected against, we're talking about a trait with low fitness. So therefore, individuals, they reproduce or they don't. So here, the survivors are the ones who are able to reproduce, and their traits are the ones that are passed to the next generation. So an individual does not evolve. It's a population as a whole. When we talk about this, it's like individuals, they survive or they don't. They reproduce or they don't. And overall, that whole population is going to become better camouflaged, or faster, or stronger, or bigger, or smaller, depending on what the environmental context is. So it's populations that evolve because individuals are selected for or against. Okay. Good job.